Okay, time for some more weathering. So this little demo starts with that little pencil sketch, and I've got a photographic background that I did, which is just one of my abstract motion blur backgrounds. And I start by isolating the sketch off of the background, up-resing a little bit, and then I'm going to drop in the background value and color, set it behind my drawing layer, and then I'm starting with this photograph that I took at the Oakland Air Museum, and this is kind of the color palette and materials that I want to play with. And when you're first starting out defining a material, this is a really fun, quick, super quick way to work. It's just cut and paste a photograph that's got the colors you want, has the kind of feel that you want, and throw it right on top. And I made it a clipping path layer again, which you've seen me do throughout the book, and I'm just warping it around. And you see I'm trying to get the horizon line for my reflection to match the shape where we would expect it to happen, but it's loose. I'm just going to use this as my base color, so I'm not trying to get it to be exactly, a match. And I set those. I'm experimenting with the layer compositing. I have one set to overlap. Now they're both set to normal. I'm just changing the opacity. And so you see there's my base layer, and I'm going to paint in a ground plane. And I'm picking the colors and values from within my object. I actually went up there and turned on the photograph, and I pulled the color that was reflecting, which is the color of the ground, to get my ground color. So I actually took that out of my photograph. And I did a motion blur on it. And that kind of sets the initial color and value for my environment. Now I'm going to go in and do a little silhouette cleanup, because to take that graphite sketch off my background white piece of paper, I just used the magic wand and just did a rough kind of skanky looking selection, and which is totally fine. Now I just have to go back, clean it up, and I would have to go back and clean it up anyway to refine the shapes. The sketch itself was only, I don't know, maybe 2 inches wide. And I'll go back and refine even more as I start painting. Now the idea on this one, I wanted to do full color rendering, weathered materials, because that's the part of the book it's for, and I wanted to have it be a bit looser, more painterly than, like, say, the automotive stuff we did earlier that was really tight, using pads all over the place. This one's going to be more painterly, and a bit, I won't say experimental, just say loose. It's going to be looser. So here I'm going to my base layer. I'm using a color dodge brush. You'll see my mode setting up there at the top upper left says color dodge, and it has some texture to it as well. So it has a little texture, and that's making some scratches in my metallic surfaces. And I know it's going to be metallic, so I'm really pushing the reflection of the light source. Even early on, I'm just taking a guess at the forms and saying, okay, these are going to be my brightest brights. This is going to be where the light source is reflecting the strongest off of this metallic surface. And the metal in this case is a polished aluminum, but it could also be a painted surface that has a little metal flake in it. That you get the net effect is the same. A very strong glow of the light source. Here I'm adding a little Fresnel effect, so a little bit of reflection of the environment, and you'll see I'm using a color stamping brush and just a round airbrush set to color stamp, and you see the little plus sign blipping around. That's the area that I'm selecting. So wherever I think my line of sight is going to bounce off of that shape, that's the area of my environment that I select. And I'm putting it on a clipping path layer above my base layer. And so I just click in the environment to where I think my line of sight is going to bounce off of my shape towards, take that color and value, stick it on top of my shape. And here I'm adjusting the base levels, the base values of the base layer, which was too light overall. Okay, and I put that Fresnel layer floating on the very top. And what that does is it ties it to my environment. And now I'm adding a little bit of I added a layer mask. And now I'm coming back and only keeping the glow of the environment right out at the silhouette. So effectively have made the parts of the surface that are pointing towards us a little bit more transparent, meaning that are more perpendicular to my line of sight. And where they're more tangent, that's where they should reflect more of the color and value of the environment. You see, it's all kind of loose and sloppy, and that's kind of the way I want it. I want to have a lot of texture, sort of a hand-painted look from my original graphite sketch showing through. I want to capture and keep a lot of that texture. So here I just colorized a little bit, some elements, and you'll see the Fresnel is on the very top, so I can colorize this whatever I want. It's still going to reflect the color of the environment. So I'm applying those basic fundamentals about the physics of reflectivity, even in a super quick and loose sketch, with even that has a ton of texture on it. And you see all those things are kind of mixing. You get the graphite sketch, you have a little bit of the photographic element, and then when I start to paint over the top, I just glaze over the top, color and value picking from within. Get a little more blue going into there. But once I have my basic palette, the values and the colors, so you hear say I'm doing both. I'm doing color rendering and value at the same time, which can be a little bit tougher to get the values right, but it's also quite fun. Either there's no right or wrong. You do either way. You could do grayscale and then colorize after. You can see the hard part about painting color is there's a big temperature change around that highlight. You can see where it's like white in the middle, then it goes yellow, then it goes orange, then it goes to a gray, then it kind of goes to a blue-gray. Well, that's tough to just go in and paint that because you have to use all those different colors as you get closer to the hot spot or the reflection of the sun. And that can be actually easier to create that color shift and that temperature shift just by color dodging after the fact. Because remember, that's how I created that highlight. And the temperature change from white, yellow to orange came from color dodging. Whereas painting it, you have to pick each one of those colors. And so that can be slower and a little bit tougher. So I think reflective highlights, when they reflect the light source, especially the sun, are much easier to do by color dodging with a color dodge layer floating on top. In this case, I just did it to the base layer, which is fine. So you see I have kind of a cleanup layer floating on the very top, and I'm just going around with a little hard edge brush and color picking and value picking from what I've already established in that first like 10 minutes of the rough out where I established those highlights. And now it's just try to refine the design and the surfaces, add cut lines, add details. Again, all the big surfaces first, then come back and add the smaller details. You can, of course, do that on separate layers, or in this case, just sort of treat it like a traditional media rendering and just go in and do that all on basically just a couple of layers. Like all this cleanup is happening just on one layer. See the big surface first, then a cut line across it, then details. So get the big stuff working, then cut it. And just basically freehanding the whole thing. And you'll notice that I've got my, I did that Fresnel layer early, and it really helps tie my reflective form into the environment. And I also got that grain of the graphite sketch from below, and that's adding a lot of weathering. I'm going to make this thing super weathered, like it's, you'd see on a 50-year-old car, pitted and grained, kind of destroyed surface. I love doing weathering. It's really fun. It gives a lot of history to a shape or to a surface, and it's just fun to render. You can get a lot of color shifting happening, which is nice. You can get a lot of texture, which is always fun to look at. And that's that surface right through the middle there is pretty close to being done. for this style. It's got just enough photorealism that when you glance at it, it looks real, and it looks reflective, which was my goal. I wanted this metal surface, and it also looks old and weathered. Part lines are a bit dented up. The surface is totally dented up. And if I didn't start with that graphite sketch, I'd have to work much harder to try and get all of that grain in there. So a lot of times I like to start with a traditional media sketch that has a lot of the graininess already built into it, and leave it on the base layer at the bottom, and then just start glazing over the top. And you don't want to go too far. So a lot of my brushes, which you can download, hopefully by now you found the download page on our links, same place that these videos link out of. You can go and download some basic brushes, nice range of basic. You see it, I'm really only using one brush here. It's a little triangle brush. It was made by Danny Gardner, so I can't really give it away to you because it's his brush. But it's just a triangle with a texture. I think it's actually a dual brush, so it's got a texture set to it, and it has pressure sensitivity. Other than that, it's basically just a triangle. The nice thing about the triangle, it paints with a lot of texture. It also gives me a hard edge for control, and the way it overlaps gives me kind of a nice patina to the surface that's almost creating more weathering. Yeah, and you just keep noodling around. The other thing I like to do, you see I've just freehand put in that cut line. I like to put in those cut lines freehand because it gives them more character in this case, so it looks like it's been a bit beat up, like somebody's taken on and off those panels and thrown them on the ground, and the edges have become a little dented, and so that's a way to keep the visual interest of those textures and the weathering and the sort of sense of age of an object, is to just do all those things freehand and let them be loose and wiggly. It's this thing's all about being wobbly surfaces, dents, bent little grill elements to the intake and exhaust vents there. So don't try to be too clean. You're just going to kill the character of the weathering. And again, the weathering should tell a story. What type of environment has this been in? If it's been in this color environment behind, like sort of dusty, we should see a lot of that color built into the crevices and stuck to the surfaces. And at the very end, we'll add some debris and some blowing elements that kind of have been sandblasting off the painted surfaces. So here I'm laying in just using a line tool and a couple of guides on a separate layer on the very top, just laying in some perspective guidelines. So it's 1 point perspective, so I chose that point right there through the middle of the object, and now I can true up the points of the near side leg and the far side leg, much like that value mech rendering that was done back on was it page 132, I believe. Same sort of thing, same step here too. I'm just using a path to clean up the silhouette. It's in the end, actually, it's quite a bit faster, especially with these long, slightly curving lines. That's difficult to paint. Much easier to use a path for that and much faster. So make a selection, and I just did Command Shift C, which is copy merged. I think that's what I did there, and then pasted it back in place, and then I've just put a clipping path layer on it now that I have the silhouette. Actually, it looks like, I'll take it back, I think I chopped that off of the base layer. I didn't do a copy merged, otherwise it would have taken the background with it. So I just did a cut it from my base layer, set it on a layer above, and then have a clipping path layer on top of it. Now, I'm definitely cheating the light. The lighting is coming from the right in this case, towards the front of this mech, and definitely taking a lot of artistic license with the angle that it's hitting. See, this is kind of to pop little highlights into those surfaces would have to be pretty low because those are nearly vertical. But from our sort of egg-shaped body of this thing, we could see that it's a little bit more overhead. So I might come back and kill those later. I don't really remember. We'll see how it goes. But this is definitely sort of on the quicker side of rendering and more educated guesses than anything. But all based on physics, all based on observations from reality. So you can see my light angle there on that big sort of egg-shaped center body area. It tells us the light's a little bit more upright, maybe 50, 60 degrees from 60, no, probably more like 45 or 50 degrees from vertical. But it is off to the right, so these front edges you could justify would catch a little bit more light. And of course, if it's metallic, remember you get a strong reflective glow of the light source. So when it comes time to make something look metallic, just push that. You can push that effect and definitely make it stronger. And pulling out some little highlights. See that little highlight I put down there, reflective highlight, looks more like the light should be lower than what that center part tells us. All right, do the far side leg now. So I'm just moving that around. It's further away, so it's going to get smaller because of the foreshortening. And I'm going to position it so it's a little asymmetric. It's pivoting up towards the top. Then I pivoted the whole leg a little bit. And I'm just going to drop it back into shadow. A lot of times when you're doing these sort of renderings, you don't want to spend a lot of time mirroring and then drawing, painting the inside of something versus the outside on the near side leg. So a lot of times I'll just drop the far side into shadow because generally speaking, everybody knows it's symmetrical. They usually are. And so you just want to get the silhouette right. That's where we're at after probably about, let's see, this is about 3.5 times to 4 times speed. So here I'm at about 16, 17, this is probably about 1 hour, roughly, to this point. And make another path. And we're going to pull out and detail the front legs. And all the way back. Now fine tune it. And you see I always use the minimum amount of points to draw the curve because that way it's quicker and faster to come back and fine tune it if you have to move around fewer points. So try to keep those things to a minimum, and with practice you'll learn where to put them as you're drawing it, and you'll get pretty close in your initial creation of the path itself. Make a selection, and I just cut it off with the lower layer. Here I'm erasing the lower layer, cleaning it up a little bit more since we have our leg now floating above. And I didn't need the far side either because we're just going to mirror the new leg over. So there's the good leg. And adding a little bit of reflected light. You see my brush has some built-in texture to it. So you can see as I'm painting, I'm not losing the quality of my graphite sketch. This is kind of like a sphere, that joint there. So rendering it like it's a reflective sphere. Trying to get a little Fresnel effect in my painted layer there, that leg as it rolls away across the top, it starts to reflect that dark color behind it. Now right in this part, I think I'm starting to lose a little too much of my initial sketch. Part of the problem is my sketch was not very defined through there. And also, by painting over it, it's starting to look too much like a computer sketch. So here I'm trying to add back a little bit of texture by glazing over it a little bit. And I'm painting in the temperature change. So whereas this part of the front leg looks a little bit better actually. I think it's got some more of the patina left over from my graphite sketch. So you see I'm purposely putting down little strokes and pecking at it a little bit to create a little of some dents and weathering. Now if you've already watched the other weathering videos, you can see there's multiple ways to go about doing this. The other ones are sort of rendered clean and tight and finished, to a perfect surface first and then weathered after. This one is kind of all happening at the same time. I'm weathering it and painting color and defining the surfaces simultaneously. So it's a little bit trickier, and you might have to glaze back over it a few times to change the forms and rework the values, rework a silhouette, even after you've done your nice texturing. For me though, that just kind of adds more interest to the surface when you make those changes and tweak the surfaces back. So when I do those repaints, of course, unless I'm changing the silhouette, I'll just completely erase and fix that. But if I'm doing a paint over to fix a form or create a different form change, I might leave a little bit of the earlier version just to create more patina across the surface. And patina just means it has nice weathering and character. It has nice color combinations, nice grit. It's basically means an aged surface, weathered material. So here I'm popping back in some reflective highlights. I really want the thing to look metallic, some sort of alloy. So I'm really pushing that contrast. It's not a matte surface, so I'm way past halfway to black on this thing, and that contrast makes it look metallic versus matte. So don't be afraid to push that. And I've just mirrored the leg, and I'm shrinking it down in size. I'm going to put it on the far side now. Try to follow my perspective guidelines a bit. Reposition it. So you see I moved my center to the pivot point right where it attaches close to the body. And now I'm going to move my pivot point up here to that knee area. And I'm moving the front leg. And I just sort of cut and paste and move the pivot point over and over again. And that's just like it would really hinge and position itself. So I did the overall size first based on the foreshortening. Then I just cut and moved the center point and just started to pivot it around. And now this leg could look totally different because the surfaces on the far side could be very different than the surfaces we see on the outside of the leg that's closest to us. So keep that in mind. It could have an inside and an outside, and they can be quite different. If it was perfectly symmetrical right down its center line, of course, you just cut it, paste it, put it over there, and it would look just the same. I want to drop it, cheat it back into shadow a little bit. I also want to change some of the interior cut lines and some of the panels to make it look different. I'm also trying to put some details that run purposely right up against the back of that right-hand leg, and that's to help hold that edge. So effectively, I'm just making a little background there. And now I'm copying probably flattening it down. I guess I copied a layer. Oh yeah, I copied everything above to make another one of those little cheated shadows. So I want this shadow to go behind the object and to the left because our light's off to the right. So I just copied everything above, flattened it into its own layer, and throwing it down with a nice hard edge. And then I'll come back and clean up a little bit. And the key here is just to make sure that the feet where they touch the shadow leaves right from those feet. and then get some of the big features showing up in your shadow, like the big body overlapping the leg. That's the little nose part sticking out there towards the middle. Here's the kind of knee angle sticking up. It's all very, very compressed and very foreshortened, but it's going to help sell the direction of the light. There's probably a gap where the light shines between the two legs, so I'm trying to separate those a little bit. And it's also going to land on rough ground, so I'm just erasing out, and here I'm double checking my length of the shadow per my light direction. So you can see that's where I'm running the brush kind of on diagonals there. I'm sort of trying to visualize where the cast shadow might be. All right, now I've got a layer mask, and it's going to be lighter the further away it is from those upper elements, and darker right up against the feet, as we've seen throughout the book earlier with our shadow edges and the fall off. Not so much the fall off of the light, but the gradation we see in the shadow as it gets further away from the object that's casting it. And here I want to make that shadow look a little bit brighter, so to make it look a little darker, I need to change the background. So by making the background lighter, I can make the shadow look darker. I also want the same sort of quality of light that's landing on the object to look like it's illuminating my ground plane. Here I'm just using a big textured brush. You'll see I'm changing the size of the brush, much smaller into the background, much larger into the foreground, and that's helping me to foreshorten that texture on the ground plane. Yeah, that's kind of working. Rough ground, quality of the light looks about right. And I have a layer above just set to multiply above my ground plane, and I'm dropping in some big shadows that are coming from outside our scene. And the reason I know they're from far away is because the edges are very soft. So those could be light coming through a tree, it could be another big object like another one of these mechs standing nearby casting a shadow. Could be lights coming through a building, anything. But we know it's far away because the edge is soft compared to the edge that we put from the mech onto the ground. And here I've just got a sort of cloud brush and dropping in some dust. And I really just wanted to soften that background a little. And you see right there, I'm actually starting to play around with showing the shadow of the object going through the dust. So the dust is like right below the shape, and you see it's actually knocking back the far side leg. I put some dust rolling right through the center line. And now, a lot of times I put these on multiple layers so you can play around with mixing them different ways. Here I have some specks I'm adding. This could be like leaves or chunks of dirt rolling through. So I'm putting that up on top. And then I'm going to motion blur the whole thing, left, right. So a horizontal motion blur. And now I'm going to warp it so it looks like those things are getting blown around by little, swirling wind. And the second one I motion blurred even more. So I just made a copy of it and motion blurred it again. And now you can start play with your opacities. Okay, I just added a probably sharpen edges, or what am I doing here? That one was accented edges, I believe. This is a smart sharpen. I wanted some more grit, because I used the photographic texture early in the body of the object. My ground, when I painted it, inside Photoshop, it looked too soft. It looked too digital. So I wanted to get back a little bit more photographic grit and contrast into it. So by using that little accented edges filter first, it accentuated my edges that I had painted. So it looked a little too soft before. And by accenting that and pushing that contrast of the edges, it starts to look more photographic. And then I did a smart sharpen to it to also make the edges, get a little bit more, I would say a little more crunchy, to match the photographic texture that was on the mech itself. Okay, here I've got a layer. Well, I'm not using the layer yet. I'm just making a new path layer, And I'm putting a bunch of circles on this, and those are tough to paint freehand, so I'll use paths for those. And I'm looking at my perspective. I line up the minor axis going back to my vanishing point, change the degree a little bit depending how far away it is from my minor axis, or in this case it's in alignment with a leg but it's far away from my image center. Just copy and paste that and make a little stripe that wraps around that. I want that stripe's going to really help us communicate, help me communicate to you that that leg is more cylindrical. And here I want this to be a disc, so we're going to see just the top of it. Okay, now I've got a layer set up for that cleanup using all those ellipses. And I'm going to come back in and refine this up to that top edge that we see. And it's going to help give it a little bit of one-point perspective. Still want it to look beat up, like it's dented. Understand it's on the underbelly, so that the odds of this thing catching a lot of debris and whatever, running into stuff as it's going over rough terrain, is pretty high. And then I'm going to overlap that little junction, which is coming out of the center of the object, and I want it to just overlap the back edge of that ellipse, because where it's attaching is right towards the middle, like it's a little fin that comes down and attaches the middle of the circle. So just get that overlap there a little bit. That'll help it look believable. And I'm choosing all those paths, and then I just did a stroke path, which is the second button on that path menu. Used a little small brush. Now I'm going to come back and erase out those edges, and then just come back, add a little reflective highlight on that cut line. And you see I put it on the left side of that cut line because my light is coming from the right. So that's the little cylinder part of that cut line that would catch the light. The other side would be more in shadow. The left edge here would be catching the light. And I'm just colorizing it. And pushing the saturation a bit. I really like the super saturated red, so pushing that. Added a little bit of Fresnel / reflected light. Right, a lot of times those will end up in the same spot. And adding now a little bit of perspective, so that helps to, that'll overlap just a little bit on the far side, helps us to see the gap between those two legs, tells us that there are two legs, because it's hard to tell in the side view. Okay, so there's a little color stripe with a little cut line running around it. And now I'm going to add a graphic. Classic number 5, a la Speed Racer. Looking for a font that I like. Haven't found it yet. Getting closer. And there we go. So there's my number 5 on a separate layer. And now I always build these things first flat. I accidentally put it on the wrong layer, so let's pull it off. Okay. So build these first flat, like it's a draft view with no perspective, and then we warp the entire thing into perspective after. So there, I put those three together. Let's just selected the 3 layers on the right and hit Command E, which is merge selected. And now I'm going to wrap it. And it's nice because you have these 9 quadrants, which are all squares. Especially when it starts out around a circle, it's a square. It makes it easier to just make that mesh line up with the sections that you could imagine wrapping across that surface. So I darkened it a bit so I could add a little more color to it. I've just colorized a little bit. Okay, and added a little layer mask. So I have 2 layers combining together. I have the bright one underneath, and I have the one on top that's darker. And then I just added a little layer mask to try and get a little gradation across it. And the gradation across it is what helps it to stick to the form. Okay, I put all those in a group so I can go back and always keep those if I wanted to mess with them. And then I copied that group, flattened it using Command E. I've now added a layer mask, and I've got a hard edge brush, again the triangle brush, and I went back and just weathered it. And the weathering is just one layer mask, I should say. Once I had the 5 logos sticking on the side of it with enough of a gradation to look like it was sort of lit by the same light source, then I went back with the layer mask and took out the part line that's cutting through it, and I chipped away some of the paint. So you see a lot of the weathering in this one is inherent to my using a graphite sketch that I scanned. So I got a lot of that weathering and texture from my initial traditional media drawing. So don't forget, you can always mix those things, right? Just because you're working digitally doesn't mean you have to start digitally. So you can start with traditional sketches and then scan them, or take a picture. I've taken lots of pictures just with my iPhone and thrown them into Photoshop and started painting right over the top. It works actually great. When you're doing that, just be careful you don't get a lot of distortion. So try to take the photograph as perpendicular to the paper surface as you can, so your sketch doesn't get all whacked and warped out of proportion because you're shooting it at a weird perspective angle. So a little more detailing. And at this point we're kind of into noodle time. I've got all the big stuff working. So we're kind of into noodling at this point. See, the thing that's tricky about these mech things and anything that's got a lot of complexity is that you just have to be patient, because it's these little details and connecting all of these bigger elements with the small details that really can bring it to life. So try to be patient. I think this rendering all total, I'm going to guess, was about 3 to 4 hours. That's kind of a wide range. Let's say 4 hours. Make you be more patient. So this thing, let's see, we're into our this last 15 minutes here will represent the last hour of noodling this rendering. And even though it's loose and painterly and has texture, it still takes time. And sometimes, don't try to paint all those textures. Get a lot of those out of photographs by layering them on top. Do what I was just talking about by using a traditional media sketch and scanning those. I like to mix all those mediums together, the traditional, the digital. They're both are great for different things. Both have their strengths, and try to work with both quite a bit. And I like the two together, of course. It's really somehow gives the digital a bit more warmth, and easy to create, I think, a lot of visual interest. And it also sets your work apart digitally because it has a traditional media element that can be difficult to create digitally, and that can give your work a little bit more personality than maybe somebody who's doing digital only, or somebody who's doing a lot of photo bashing. Photo bashing is what we call the technique where I started at the beginning of this, where I took the polished aluminum and threw it on top of my pencil sketch. That's just mixing a whole bunch of photographs and then painting back over the top. And of course you get a lot of photographic elements showing up. It's great for production work and entertainment. That's where it's used the most, I would say. Professionally, there's lots and lots of photo bashing going on because it's really fast and it's really simple. But sometimes it can lack an illustrative quality that you can get out of a hand-done marker or pencil sketch. So I default back to that traditional media stuff to try and bring a little more character to the work. Okay, just fine-tuning. And see, once you get good at working with the values, it makes it easy to go in and detail out little shadow areas, highlight areas, control where the eye is focused. by controlling the contrast. And there's lots of layers of information into those little shadow zones, and even the silhouette of this underside is really fun to just drop it all back into shadow and just play mostly with the silhouette to provide some visual interest. And a little bit of reflected light, just to turn some of those surfaces back towards the ground plane. And now I'm adding another big slot onto this. Sort of, it looks like a flat panel that's got a slot in it and another little cutout here, a little red button or detail in it. Alright, this is all turned under. This is all in shadow, so it should really just have some reflected light only on that little red disc. And I'm hinting at a few more mechanical shapes, just all back in shadow, so really just using a silhouette to show those. Alright, so we're getting pretty close. So you saw from the very beginning, right, I threw down a photographic background. That gave me my color palette for the background to reflect into all the surfaces for my Fresnel colors and values. And then I threw the photograph of that airplane over the top, and that's all I used for the base color and get me going on the textures. And here I've got kind of a flat conical, kind of a shallow cone shape sitting on top of a cylinder. So I'm taking out what would be like a flat disc at the back of this shape and blending it over and intersecting it with that nearly horizontal cylinder. And from having built models, I sort of can predict that transition a little bit better. So if you're having trouble with your transitions and estimating what they might be, then sometimes it's really fast to just grab a lump of clay and quickly mock it up and hold it up to your desk light and see what would happen. To be honest, with rendering, that's a really fast way to work, is just observe and reference reality, and that can really greatly inform your ability to render from your imagination. And as you get better from experience in doing that, right, you'll sort of build those little form changes into your memory, and then they're kind of available for you. And doing that is you're building your, what we call a visual library, building your visual library of value changes and forms, and you can always call on those later, while you're rendering, sort of free-forming these renders as you go along. Because this is kind of all the elements we've talked about in the book happening at once. We've got the value, we have the color, the texture, the weathering, and doing design all at the same time. I mean, it's design refinement. I knew the general direction, but it's definitely not that refined. So this is the time to refine it. And you see, I'm just being aware of the environment around it, trying to use the colors and values from the environment as they would reflect into my surfaces. And it does two things. One, it keeps it from floating off the page and looking disconnected to the environment. That's actually most important. Two, it keeps my value structure right. You can see where I'm color picking from. My value structure stays the way I first established, which means the shadow sides stay where they are, the highlights stay where they are, and I'm just refining based on those. And here I need to add a couple more little highlights, reflection of the sun. You see the hand done look starts to make it all look like it's really beat up. So I get a lot of weathering just by painting everything by hand. And I like that old beat up look. Here's a little reflection of that edge. Probably means that this thing is much wider at the back if my line of sight's reflecting back over to that little highlight on that sort of domed shape. Alright, closing in on it. Now it's just dial it in a bit, clean up the silhouette. So here I'm going to add a little serrated silhouette shape, something that maybe is painted dark, running right along the center line. And the way I make it look like it's along the center line is I put a little lit edge right in front of it, and that looks like it rolls under towards the reflected light, and then it goes vertical, right, because it gets darker. And then if I wanted to put a little radius on that serrated shape, I would again repeat the reflected light. Referencing my perspective again. So we see a little bit, that's like a flat disc there. So we should see a little bit of the inside of it. And a little reflected light. And you see I kind of glaze a lot, which means that I'm working to keep the transparency. Even though you see my brush is almost always set to 100 and 100 on the opacity and flow, but it's very pressure sensitive. So I can actually glaze over and paint slightly transparent, right, or actually very transparent passes with the brush, even though it's set to 100 and 100. So don't let that mislead you. It's not 100% opaque. It is if I press very hard. But if I keep a very light touch, I can glaze over the surfaces and build up my opacity. There I turned it down to 24 because I wanted to glaze over even lighter. For some big, wanted to add back a little more texture. And there's no little form change there, and see I'm communicating the form change just with the reflected light. Or because it's a shiny shape, you could say the reflection of the ground. The net effect is the same, which is I get a value change. And if I get a value change, you guys all know by now that with that value change, your brain is going to see a form change. Never forget that. That's just the simplest thing you can ever always rely on. Right? Value changes will make your object look like it has three-dimensional form. Adding a little more texture, truing up some of my surfaces, my cut lines. I didn't really like the asymmetry of that grill, so now I'm making it even more asymmetric as opposed to spending the time to make it symmetrical. Adding little details here and there. And again, like any rendering, these you can just keep going and going, right? Defining more and more surfaces, more and more materials. In this case, we have really just two, maybe I should say three primary materials. We've got a reflective alloy material, which we took from our original polished aluminum photograph of the airplane. We have a matte dark black painted surface, which also came from our base photograph. That's a kind of a crown right across the very top of the body. That's like a matte black, which is also like the serrated center line. We have some matte black mechanical elements towards the middle, and then we've got some red metallic painted surfaces, which the very last thing will be to chip those off a little bit. And see, that makes it look metallic, what I just did right there. That before looked more like it was glossy red, and now it's got a nice reflective highlight across where it would, if it was metallic, it would reflect the sun. And I'm doing one pass here, color dodging. You see my brush mode is set to color dodge. Very low opacity, like 16%, because you get there really fast. And my brush is just a round brush that has a little texture to it. So I'm actually, when I color dodge this, I'm actually putting in a few little scratches into the surface. Okay, changing some of my compositing. All right, I'm going to take all of those guys and put them. So this is going to be a copy merge. That's why I turned off the background, so I wouldn't change my silhouette. If you do a copy merged with that lasso tool, you're going to actually change the silhouette because it'll grab your background as well. So here I wasn't not convinced about the red, so playing with it a little bit, just using color balance, hue change, and actually I'm going to use this for the base metal. Okay, so what I did there is put it on a layer. I just did a layer mask. I shifted it to that metal color, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to chip the paint around any little cut lines and edges, and the bottom surface here gets really chipped because there might be rocks and things popping up. And I clean up the edge. I want it to only show up underneath my paint, the red paint, and as the red paint gets chipped off, it exposes this bare metal. And I made the bare metal just by selecting the red areas, changing the levels to be brighter and higher contrast, and to shift the color. And now when I chip, just using a layer mask, use a hard edge brush and chip off the paint. Really effective. It kind of gives you two renderings in one, because if you just turn off the layer mask, then it's all the way back to the painted red material. So it works really great for weathering. It's my favorite little last detail thing to do to get the weathering working. A nice chipped paint look. All right, so that's basically going to finish it up. We're into the last couple minutes here. The last thing to do is maybe play with a little bit of scale. So I've got the blowing dust coming through there, and here I've got some figures I dropped in for scale. So there's an alien dude running underneath there, and that's pretty much it. Hope you find that helpful, and try weathering some surfaces. It's a lot of fun. Gives your materials a lot of character, puts them into an environment, gives them history and a backstory. Have fun.